I've never really visited this sub before, but I wanted to share this story with someone. I really can't find a reasonable explanation for what happened that night. It was just a strange and alarming experience. This all happened a few months ago. My friend had heard that the northern lights might be visible in our area and asked if I wanted to go for a drive out into the country to see if we could catch a glimpse. So we headed out after dark and drove for a while, putting the city behind us and winding out into the countryside, all while scanning the skies and just searching for a good vantage point where the stars and the lights might be visible. But several hours passed, and with nothing to show for our efforts, we started to give up on seeing the lights altogether. As we discussed what to do next at that point, my friend noted that we were close to her hometown and reminded me that she had been wanting to visit the local cemetery to find the graves of some of her distant relatives. She had recently been researching her genealogy. It was a clear, warm night, and we were both pretty disappointed that we hadn't seen the lights. We both wanted to make the trip worthwhile, so we agreed to swing by the cemetery. We pulled into the dirt road adjacent to the cemetery and walked around until we found the right graves. She took some photos, and we decided to just wander around for a little while. My friend was leading the way, using the flashlight on her phone to light the path and to ensure that we didn't accidentally step on any of the graves. I had been feeling increasingly anxious since we arrived, which struck me as just a bit odd. I have done several cemetery seriation projects as an archaeologist and don't normally feel nervous in cemeteries even at night. In fact, I usually find that cemeteries are pretty peaceful and calming, but I felt really strange in that particular graveyard and found myself frequently spinning around because I felt like someone was standing behind me. Still, I just chalked it up to general anxiety and tried not to dwell on it. One of the problems with having an anxiety disorder is that it's sometimes hard to tell when your nervousness is justified. Even in retrospect, I don't know if my anxiety was just in my head or if it was related to what would happen next. After wandering for a while, we realized that it was approaching 1 a.m. and that we should probably get back home. We turned back and headed toward the car. My friend's car was in sight, and she was a few yards ahead of me when it happened. I suddenly got a wave of that nervous feeling again and thought that I heard someone running up behind me. I was starting to turn my head to look back when I felt something collide with my back, the initial impact hitting me right between my shoulder blades. There was a substantial weight behind it, as if someone had actually hurtled into me. The impact was so forceful that I was thrown forward and fell flat on my face, and as I scrambled to get back up, I felt the weight pressing into my shoulders again and was shoved back down. I then glanced up to see my friend running toward me. She had also heard someone running up to us, had heard my initial fall, and had turned just in time to see me being pushed back down. She would later tell me that she had seen my sweatshirt flattening against my back and shifting, as if someone had been pressing their hands against my shoulders. She grabbed my arm to pull me up just as the weight disappeared, and we both bolted to the car, jumping in and instinctively locking the doors. She wasted no time starting the engine and then hastily peeled out of the driveway. As soon as we hit the main road, we just sped away from there as quickly as possible. We drove for several minutes without saying a word. I think we were both stunned and, more than anything, confused. She finally glanced at me and said, "What the hell just happened?" I didn't quite know how to answer that. I told her that someone had shoved me to the ground, and she said, "I know, I saw. But what was that?" There was nothing there. We tried to come up with a rational explanation, but none of them made any sense. Had someone ambushed me and then bolted? Definitely not. We would have seen them. Had I tripped? No, I had definitely felt something pushing me, and my friend had seen me being shoved back down. Had it been the wind? Not possible. There hadn't been so much as a breeze that night, and if there had been some freak gust of wind, it would have hit my friend too. Perhaps an animal had attacked me? But that didn't seem possible either. There were no local animals large enough, strong enough, and stealthy enough to topple a full-grown human without being seen. I had been in full view of my friend, illuminated by her flashlight, during the second fall, and the weight had remained at my shoulders even as she was coming right up to me. She should have been able to see whatever had been pushing me. If nothing else, an animal would have cast visible shadows beneath the glare of her flashlight. But there was nothing. We just couldn't explain it. Whatever had pushed me, twice, it hadn't been visible to us. As the adrenaline faded, I noticed something else. My back hurt. Right between my shoulder blades, right where I had felt the impact, I could feel a sort of stinging, prickly sensation. It felt like my back, despite being covered by my sweatshirt, had somehow been brushed with stinging nettles. I mentioned this to my friend, and she insisted on pulling over to the side of the road to look at my back. She switched the hood light on in the car and pulled the collar of my hoodie down to look. I heard her mutter, "What the fuck?" She took a photo of my back and showed it to me. The skin between my shoulder blades was reddened, and several little blisters had started to appear. In the days that followed, the blisters would later swell up and pop. It was as if I had somehow gotten a sunburn or a bad chemical burn. There weren't any scratches or cuts. There were no open wounds, no blood. It was a relatively subtle mark, but it was still clearly there, and it baffled us. We certainly couldn't figure out how I'd gotten burned. I hadn't rubbed up against anything, I hadn't touched my back. I'd been wearing my hoodie all night, and there were no tears or marks in the fabric. And the burn hurt. It continued to sting for several days. You can see the photo here. I couldn't sleep that night. My back hurt, and every time I started to drift off, I'd suddenly begin to fear that someone was standing over my shoulder, and I would startle awake. I couldn't really understand what had happened at the cemetery, but it truly rattled me. I don't exactly know where I stand on the issue of paranormal phenomena, to be honest. As an anthropologist, I'm trained to keep an open mind, but I still have to rely on a deeply academic and often empirical perspective. Still, I know that something truly bizarre and frightening happened that night, and my inability to explain it, to account for every strange little detail, has been deeply disturbing. It's also been especially difficult to grapple with this because I already have PTSD from a previous assault, and there is something profoundly unsettling about the fact that, in this instance, there is nothing I could have done to defend myself. And with no clear explanation for it, there is no way for me to prevent something like this from happening again. I cannot cope with a fear that I cannot even begin to understand. It's also begun to affect my dreams. I've had several odd nightmares since the incident in the cemetery. Dreams that are oddly similar to the nightmares that I'd had for years when I was growing up. I don't know where they came from, but for as long as I can remember, I've had dreams in which a creature is attempting to lure me in one way or another. And in the dreams, I usually understand this creature to be a devil or a demon. Simply put, sometimes evil. Something dangerous and, like the entity in the graveyard, difficult to understand. These dreams have become suddenly relevant again, as I seem to have them nearly every time I fall asleep these days. I know that, likely due to trauma, hopefully not due to anything more sinister, these dreams and the experience in the graveyard are somehow linked. Sometimes the menacing creature in my dreams takes the form of an old woman. I had one dream when I was about 13 years old, in which I was wandering through a forest. I came across a little cottage with this old woman standing by the porch. She beckoned me inside, and I acquiesced. We spent some time casually talking and baking cookies, but I felt uneasy around her and got the sense that she wanted something from me. We stayed only in the kitchen throughout the dream, but I can recall glancing at the doorways to other rooms and seeing nothing but shadowy edges. I thought that perhaps I should try to leave, but couldn't remember how to find my way out. At one point, as we sat at the kitchen table, I glanced out the window and noticed a group of people standing in the yard, calling out to the old woman. I asked who these people were, and she told me, "They want me to take them in, but I don't want them. I want you." In other dreams, it has had a more sinister appearance, but I always recognize it as the same creature. I sometimes have dreams in which it is sitting in the dark at my bedside, whispering to me. It has a shadowy appearance with long, lanky limbs and empty eye sockets. Its teeth are made of razor wire, and there is something like blood or wine gleaming on its lips. Like this. In those dreams, I can hear it whispering but can't understand what it's saying. Sometimes I have dreams of the same creature sitting in a chair in the corner of my room, eating what seems to be a rotten apple. I have long suspected that this creature is some manifestation of my deepest and most troubling fears. I know these are just dreams, but I mention it because those dreams had subsided in my early 20s. But the incident at the cemetery rattled me so much that they've returned. It seems to have shaken my understanding of the world around me, opening the floodgates to my own inner demons. In these new dreams, that creature is standing upright behind me at the cemetery. Time seems to be slowing down. I can sense my friend frozen ahead of me, and the creature is whispering at my back. I don't really know why my mind is conflating that dream creature with my encounter at the cemetery, but the fear has increasingly kept me up at night. I have no idea what TF happened that night. My friend believes it was a ghost, but I just don't know. I've just never personally experienced anything like this. I really don't know what to do with it. Thanks for reading. I've always held something of an affinity for cemeteries. Every family vacation included a trip to one famous ones, at least. Key West, New Orleans, Savannah, San Francisco, Philadelphia. I suppose it was because of my parents' love of history that they brought us to these places. But my parents also tried to instill in my siblings and I the value of life and a respect for the deceased. Needless to say, since a young child I've found cemeteries to be places of beauty. In the city where I grew up, cemeteries were obviously cemeteries. But when I moved to the South, I started encountering small, private, family-style garden cemeteries littered throughout rural areas. These fascinated me. Some years later, I purchased a home and unintentionally ended up buying in a neighborhood just a mile away from a large cemetery, or as they call the grounds, a memorial park. It's a large cemetery in the middle of a large public park. While the park's hours are sunrise to sunset, there are no gates at the entrance or exit. Public indeed. I enjoy running and incorporate it into my cardio routine as much as possible. I know there are mixed feelings about people exercising in cemeteries, but as I noted above, given my background and upbringing, I never saw my presence in a cemetery as being disrespectful, and would sometimes include a run to and/or through the memorial park in my route. However, I'd usually turn down the volume of my earbuds real low while I was on the grounds, and I only ever kept to the paved road, avoiding any walking trail or path. One fall, just as the evening temperatures were getting cooler, I miscalculated my run and ended up a quarter of the way into the memorial park, right at about sunset. I would never run in the park after dark. Ever. Partly because I didn't want to break the rules, and partly because I felt that would have been disrespectful. The sun was setting, but it hadn't yet set. There was plenty of daylight, but it was fading fast. I should have turned around and run right out the park, but for whatever reason I didn't. What I did do was turn off my music and picked up my pace. I had every intention to get out of there and fast. About halfway through the park, my legs, almost involuntarily, slowed down and my run became light jog, became a walk, and then I just stopped. In all the times I'd been on these grounds, I'd never heard such silence. No birds, no bugs, no rustling of leaves or branches, not even the wind chimes adorning several of the trees made a sound. There was this unusual silence that hung heavy in the air. I stood there and looked around. I didn't see anything, but I felt a whole lot. I willed my feet to move, but after just a few steps I stopped again. Goosebumps then traveled from the top of my head all the way down my body, hairs on my arms and legs standing on end, and my breath caught at my throat. It felt like something was watching me, and it did not want me there. Instead of staying on the paved road that would have looped me around the rest of the park and then back out to the exit, I caught sight of a path, just a few feet away, that I knew would cut through the park and take me to the exit in a straight shot. "Sorry, I'll head out," I said aloud. This time my feet didn't fail me, and sure enough, almost as soon as I started down the path, the silence started to slowly lift, like all the nature around me started to slowly fade up. By the time I was a good 50 feet from the exit, a breeze blew through the park, and the evening air just came alive again, wind chimes and all. But by then, the sun had fully set, and what little of daylight remained was fading and fast. It was then I realized that whatever compelled me to stop my run to make my way out of the cemetery had done so at the right moment. I'd only been halfway through the park. Had I continued on my run, it would have been dark by the time I made it to the exit. Also, interrupting my run right at the path that intersects the park could not have been a coincidence, could it? In fact, the part of the cemetery I avoided by not continuing on the road was the older part of the cemetery, the part with the original mausoleums and military graves. The part of the cemetery with the old money family plots, bigger, older trees, denser foliage. Something inside me told me whatever I'd just experienced wasn't malicious. The heaviness, fear, uncertainty I'd felt turned into something like appreciation. Just before I walked out, I turned around, gave a slight bow, hand over my heart, and softly said, "Thank you." I know it was dark and my eyes could have very well been playing tricks on me, but I swear I saw the blur of a shadow move behind a tree immediately to my right. My mom and stepdad were the caretakers of a small cemetery for about 10 years. All of us kids, 6 between the two of them, helped out at one point or another. One summer I was helping my mom with mowing and upkeep. It was a super hot summer, so we would try to go and get the mowing done early before the heat became too unbearable. Well, we had trouble getting the truck going one day, so we ended up starting a little later than usual and were unable to finish up everything that day. My mom had an appointment the next morning, and the day after that, it was supposed to rain, so I told her I would go up early the next morning and finish up the trimming with the weed eater. So, it's about 7 in the morning, and I am listening to music with my headphones and going around the headstones. Everything was going well until I got to the oldest section of the cemetery. That part was on a small slope of a hill. Once you got to the bottom and looked up, you couldn't see the road, but you could see it again once you were about halfway up. When I finished up the last headstone, I turned off my equipment and started back up the hill. I glanced up in time to see a little girl in a pretty red dress. She was running and disappeared behind a large headstone. I figured her parents were visiting another grave, and the little girl ran off to entertain herself. It was around 9 a.m. at this point. I got to the top of the hill, and there was no car or people around. The cemetery wasn't really close to any houses, and the girl was too nicely dressed to have walked out there. I looked around and shouted for her to come out. I was able to see the headstone she ran behind, and I would have seen her if she ran out again. I couldn't find her anywhere. I called my mom and told her what was going on and asked if I should call the police and tell them about this little girl. She looked to be about 3 or 4 years old, so she certainly shouldn't be by herself. My mom asked me if she was wearing a red dress. I said yes. Why? So, she proceeds to nonchalantly tell me that was just the ghost girl. Now, everyone who knows me knows that I don't fuck with ghosts. I asked why she didn't tell me there was a ghost in the cemetery. She said she needed my help and was afraid I wouldn't go up if I thought it was haunted. Now granted, I probably would have been more leery of the place, but knowing no one else could help her, I would have still helped her that summer. But I would have made sure I wasn't there by myself. I still go there sometimes as I have relatives buried there, but I am always with someone. Fortunately, I never saw any other ghosts, and I have never seen the little ghost girl ever again. Yes, it's true what they say about living near a cemetery. You are more likely to be haunted. I would know because I experienced a few hauntings myself. I was around 18 when I first moved into my new place. I lived with my boyfriend, who was a few years older, and we did share some experiences, but I seemed to have more alone. The cemetery and mausoleum were about 50 feet from our place, and it is a decent-sized cemetery. Horrible nightmares plagued my sleep, and I would wake up scrambling from my side of then bed. One time, I even pushed my boyfriend off the bed completely. I remember frantically trying to get away from whatever I was seeing in my sleep. I had always reassured myself that I suffered from sleep paralysis, the uncomfortable sensation of being awake but unable to move your body. But seeing and hearing what was going on around you, it started at a young age, around 7 to 8, and lasted until I was in my late 20s. When it happened, I would talk to myself and attempt to keep calm. So, when it started in my new place, I really didn't associate the new horrifying experiences with my new place. What were my dreams? It would involve something standing by my bed. Nothing of significance would happen other than I was aware of the presence. Most of the times I would just say, okay, it's just a dream. There is nothing to be scared of and you'll wake up soon. Sometimes this didn't happen though, and I never was aware, and I just would scramble from my side of the bed. It didn't happen every night, but enough to suck, lol. Later on, I started experiencing more obvious things. I would walk around the cemetery. The road was dirt, and me not being afraid and more comforted by it, I would run around the cemetery. There usually weren't many visitors, but the occasional family member did visit their loved ones laid to rest. I didn't run then, but otherwise, it was a calm atmosphere. I never felt creeped out or anything. If anything, I felt like nothing bad would happen to me. I never thought something would follow me home. One day, and oh boy, I have goosebumps while writing this memory, I was getting ready for my run. I was leaning over tying my shoes when something knocked on the glass table directly in front of me. 3 knocks. 1, pause, 2, pause, 3. I stopped what I was doing and was shocked still. I remember thinking, did I just hear that? And then, right next to my head on the wall, came 3 more clear knocks. This time I jumped up and ran to my boyfriend, who was in our bedroom getting dressed. I was freaking out and telling him what I heard. He believed me. He checked outside to make sure no one was actually knocking on our door, and no one was there. Not even next door. We also experienced problems with our fire alarms. They would go off at random times during the night. We tried everything. New batteries. They would start, and we would go check them, and the fire alarms would stop, and we would go back to bed. Then it would start again. My boyfriend was more religious, so he broke out his Bible one time. We were both pretty spooked. Finally, we just removed the batteries from the alarm and went back to bed. It wasn't safe, but we didn't know what else to do. We purchased new fire alarms, but they would still go off. I always told my boyfriend it was probably bugs. In the South, it's definitely a plausible explanation. Around that time, I started telling the things by my bed to go away. I would say, I don't want you here and you need to leave. I would strain with all of my being to get my point across. I honestly don't know whether to be alarmed or relieved when it started to help. This all happened over a span of about 8 years. When we broke up and I moved back into my parents', it all stopped. The only time it happened again when I stayed overnight at my new boyfriend's house, almost 4 years later. I told it to leave me alone and go away. It never happened again. I guess I could have simply grown out of my sleep paralysis, or whatever it was. Thanks for reading my long-winded story, and it feels good to get it all out. Yep, that's right. My family's house backs up to a graveyard. In fact, we back up to one of the oldest cemeteries in the state. From my understanding, the land my neighborhood was developed on in the 1970s was originally a fruit tree farm. Each of the homes on the street still has at least one fruit tree on their property as a relic of the farm. My family had an apple tree. I know that these stories should always be taken with a grain of salt. I consider myself a pretty level-headed person. My parents are physicians, and we operate under a very practical, realistic way of navigating life. And even with that understanding of how the world works, we have experienced things that we have never been able to explain. Growing up, the house always gave me an uneasy feeling. I constantly had the feeling I wasn't alone. I've had something knock on my window in the middle of the night. I've heard footsteps down the hallway. I've seen an apparition, seen things fly off the table, and had countless other experiences, big and small, that were just normal occurrences. My mom also had interesting experiences, including old toys turning on when they have no batteries, being pushed from behind while gardening, and seeing unexplained things from time to time. There would be periods of more activity and periods of quiet. During the active moments, we would refer to the house being loud. It was the loudest when one of us would get sick. Perhaps one of the strangest moments was when we found a bone in our backyard. When the bone was examined by our local forensics team, it was concluded that the bone was part to the end of a human femur with an unknown origin. They didn't give a date, but they did say it was likely several hundred years old. Weirdly enough, we found it by accident. One morning, it was sitting on top of a flower bed, maybe 20 feet from the house. At this point, the bone is family lore, as we have never been able to explain its existence. There has never been any evidence to suggest someone was buried outside of the cemetery lines. It certainly makes you wonder. No other bones were ever found. If you're wondering what we did with the bone, well, we kept it. Actually, when the very quick investigation concluded, a police officer came by to drop off the bone. Weird move, but we didn't know what to do, so we took it. Since that moment in 2006, it has sat on the mantle above our fireplace. The bone ended setting in motion a specific series of events that ended up coming to our family's aid later on in life. So we keep it up as a reminder of that moment. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything and helps me to get monetized in the future. Now watch Cute Kitten to relax.